Bodleian stones give us an idea of just how important Rosemarkie was in the early Middle Ages, and they speak of the remains of a Christian monastery, which we think is hidden under the buildings either side of the High Street and stretching down to the beach, as you see here. We've got some standing stone slabs, the most important of which, Rosemarkie stone, it's thought marked an entrance into the monastic enclave. And a number of the other stones are thought to be part of either an altar or a shrine of an early medieval saint. Now, we don't know exactly who that saint was, but there are histories and traditions surrounding the area that connect it with either St. Curator, St. Molig, and later in the Middle Ages, St. Boniface from the southwest of England, who's known as the Apostle to Germany. And here we have the incredible centerpiece, the Rosemarkie stone itself, dating to around about 800, according to the great doyens of Pictish art, George and Isabel Henderson. And you can see immediately some of the famed Pictish symbols that it still proudly boasts at that time. You've got a crescent symbol at the top, you've got a V rod, you've got this double disc, another crescent here, but with a very different treatment of its interior, another V rod, and a mirror, and another implement, possibly a ladle, liturgical or secular, seen from above. And underneath you've got, quite unusually for this sort of slab, a very intricate panel depicting a cross with 4 bosses. And of course, numerology, number symbolism is very, very important in early medieval art and has a tradition that goes right back to ancient Jewish traditions and commentary. So we'll be looking at more of these features as we go on. You can see at the very bottom there, you've got panels of Greek key and some interlace motifs. So even in this one stone, we begin to see that we've got almost like a mini encyclopedia of some of the major strands of influences that were available stylistically and culturally in this part of Scotland at the period. I think you'll probably agree that the great crescent and V-rod symbol at the top there is very reminiscent of this, which is another one of the most famous of the Pictish Class 2 slabs, the Hilton of Cadboll stone from further up the northeast coast of Scotland en route to the famous excavation site of Port Mahomac, which I'll be talking about later. And here you can see that the panel with the cross and the interlace on the Rosemarkie stone is here instead features a scene of a female rider shown side saddle with a mirror and comb, possibly symbols of gender and status, with her mounted escort and trumpeters and hounds intent on the hunt. Whether this is a secular Pictish scene or whether it's an allusion to a biblical narrative, we're not sure. Without the presence of conventional iconographies or inscriptions, it's always slightly speculative. And of course, the great riddle of Pictish symbols still remains. There's an awful lot of ink out there and images out there discussing the significance, whether they function as pictograms or quasi-hieroglyphs in the manner of Egyptian art, or whether there is some sort of linguistic code going on, or whether they're purely symbolic, whether they're emblematic totems of tribal affiliations, genealogies, profession, gender, whether they signify treaties, marriages, funerary monuments, etc. All of these things have been suggested, and there's still a great deal of ongoing debate about them, which of course is one of the great fun things about it. There are many possible and plausible explanations. And as within many aspects of what we call insular art of this period, the art of the islands, of Great Britain and Ireland, multivalence is very much a feature. Why have one meaning implicit in a thing if you can have many simultaneously, the ability to dig deep, to speak in allegory, to speak in simile and metaphor, as well as to have a what you see on the tin literal narrative approach. You'll note with the Hilton of Cabol, you've also got something rather distinctive that looks a little bit unusual, in that you've got this inhabited vine scroll with birds and other creatures living within the fronds of the vine around it. And stylistically, this is very, very close to Northumbrian art of the 8th century. So you've got another feature coming in here, not only the Pictish symbols and quite distinctive sideward facing Pictish carvings of figures, but aspects of Anglo-Saxon art appearing as well. And next to it, I put one of the very, very fine drawings from the George Bain collection. You can see that this large roundel in the corner is his drawing of these two discs here. Again, are they disc brooches? Do they reflect status and gender, etc.? The broken Z and V rods, are they representative of, if you like, burying the hatchet, the breaking of weapons, the decommissioning of weapons? All good speculations, but again, we can't be completely sure. This is a picture of the Rosemarkie stone when it was cross slab, when it still stood in the churchyard. And by analogy with the use of such freestanding monuments, both in places like Iona and some of the Irish monasteries such as Armagh, and also their use within early Christian cultures in the Middle East, notably Armenia, where they are often used to demarcate entrances into sacred areas such as monastic precincts, the nematon, where they also use as embarkation markers on pilgrimage and journey. We can imagine some of this mapping into the insular topographical landscape as well. If we look at the side of this stone again, you can see inhabited interlace panels, etc. So many, many different stylistic motifs from different cultures being brought together in this distinctive Class 2 style in the 8th century. This is again in Rosemarkie, but it's from the parish church in Crail in the East Nook of Fife. And although this one is very badly weathered, you can still see the cross at the heart of it with a rather Mozarabic looking not OG arch, but a Mozarabic style arch at the top there. And then a whole series of animal symbols. The one at the bottom here, looking very much like a camel. Here, something that could well be a calf or lion, a bear, a whole range of what are obviously designed to be recognizable animal symbols, even if some of them are quasi-mythological and certainly not the sort of thing that you would have expected to be roaming the streets of Rosemarkie at this period. Now, they remind me very much of this particular stone in, at Magel. Well, both of these two are at Magel actually, where you can see not only Daniel in the lion's den at the centre here, depicted in a way that's also redolent of earlier Germanic and Scandinavian pagan period art, where you have the human figure threatened, if you like, by beasts, but overcoming them, which is very much adapted to the Christian iconography of Christ being acknowledged by the beasts, and also of Daniel as an Old Testament type of Christ, because of his ability to quell nature. And underneath you can see a centaur carrying branches, of course very much a classical symbol associated with healing, and the texts of Dioscorides and others. So there are probably many different and complex allusions taking place on some of these stones. We've got the hunter figures and an angel here. So immediately you've got a Christianization aspect of what could otherwise be a secular hunting scene. And this very beautiful deep relief slab at Magel, again, has quasi-mythological beasts on it relating to the stone at Rosemarkie. So here again from Rosemarkie, we've got 4 interlaced human figures, from Magel, 4 interlaced human figures in a swastika symbol, an early antique symbol of life. We've got the Daniel at the centre there. We've got a panther and a mermaid at Magel, as well as things like the distinctive Pictish beast or swimming elephant, which is thought to have been derived from depictions of dolphins and porpoises in classical art. And here, a 9th century Pictish grave marker from Magel. Now, if you ever see one of these beasties coming towards you that has the body of a lion and a human head, run like blazes, because it's a manticore, and the manticore is the harbinger of death. And obviously our little Pict with his sideways profile is not going to run fast enough because he gets outrun, and this is his grave marker. Now, a number of these are biblical, obviously, but the manticore and the panther that you see here are amongst the symbols that relate to a text called the Physiologus, or the Marvels of the East. Now, this ultimately incorporates elements of tales relating to Alexander the Great and his exploration of the Indian and African continents. So they're the mythical, monstrous peoples and races. But in 4th century Christian Alexandria in Egypt, a Christian author distilled this into a text known as the Physiologus, or the Marvels of the East, which is one of the texts that lies at the core of the medieval bestiary. And it gave Christian moralized interpretations to some of these actual and mythological creatures. The panther, for example, is said to be a symbol of Christ, because when it belches, it emits an incredibly sweet fragrance that summons the whole of the rest of creation are drawn to it. And that's interpreted as Christ rising from the dead, the perfumed spices of the burial preparation, and his resurrection, summoning creation and its creatures to him. And so we seem to have a knowledge of this present within Pictland, certainly in the 8th and 9th century, if not earlier. And we certainly also have literary references to it in the works of Bede in Northumbria in the early 8th century. So we know that the text is known in Anglo-Saxon England, and certainly from the visual material in both Pictland and Ireland, we can surmise that the texts were also circulating and being used to inspire artwork there. This is a rather elaborate copy made in Canterbury in the 1020s, a thing called the Scientific Miscellany, Anglo-Saxon Scientific Miscellany. And here we have an elephant. Now, how would you draw an elephant if you'd never seen one and you were just working from Pliny's brief description that's incorporated into the text? It's not until the 13th century when King Henry III was given an elephant for the Royal Zoo in the Tower of London that Matthew Paris actually draws an elephant in these islands from the life. And it's interesting that he struggles, because all of his other depictions of bestiary subjects, he never puts kneecaps on the elephant, because Pliny tells us that the elephant doesn't have kneecaps, and that's why it's not a good idea to fight a battle sitting on top of an elephant, because rather like the creatures in Star Wars 1, when the elephant goes down on its spindly legs, then it can't get up because it hasn't got kneecaps. But when he's confronted with one in the Royal Zoo, the scientist in the Churchman can't help but actually show that it does have kneecaps. And so there we have a camel. So we can imagine that early Christian illustrated copies of this text may well have circulated and have reached an insular environment by the 8th century and have been available possibly to Pictish artists as well. Now, once you've introduced animals with a recognised symbolism to them, you can start doing all sorts of interesting things. On early Anglo-Saxon metalwork, such as the famous Sutton Hoo ship burial shoulder casts dating to the beginning of the 7th century, you can see what we call style 2 animal ornament, which I've described as everything looks like it's the love child of an elephant and a vacuum cleaner. They're very generic animal forms. They may well have had a symbolism attached to them, but it's difficult for us to be specific about something as generic as this. By the time of the Lindisfarne Gospels, made on Holy Island off of the coast of Northumbria, near Berwick-on-Tweed, in the 720s, 715 to 722 or thereabouts, we can see that by the simple addition of a naturalistic animal feature, in this case the cat, the artist has immediately unlocked other points of reference in the library of memory amongst the viewers, because for early Christians the cat is the symbol of evil waiting to pounce on the unwary, and for the Celts it's the Cerberus figure, Crutna, the cat guardian of the entrance to the other world. And that, of course, gives a whole new meaning to the solemn little procession of birds in the lower margin, much loved of George Bain in his artwork, who are heading straight for the mouth of the cat, unheeding, and 12 of whom have already been swallowed in his stomach, which snakes its way up to the top of the page. So you've got a moral allusion to the need to be ever spiritually vigilant and prepared. Sticking with the Lindisfarne Gospels for a moment, you can see that this partial three-quarter sideways view of faces is something that is very much indebted to Mediterranean art, such as this Byzantine Gospel book. This is the Lindisfarne Gospels depiction of St. Luke in both his symbolic and human guise, labelled O Ios and framed and set like an Eastern icon upon the page. And when we look at the Daniel stone in Rosemarkie, where you can see Daniel here not only flanked by lions, but literally doing the circus tamer's trick of putting his head in the mouth of the lion, we can see this distinctive fully sidewards profile with the pointed beard and nose, which ultimately has a basis in very ancient Mediterranean art, which is perpetuated in Christian Byzantine context. We can also see aspects of the animal ornament where you outline the contours and the musculature of the animals, giving things like distinctive Pictish delineation of hip spirals, etc. We'll see more of that as we go on. If we look in the Lindisfarne Gospels depiction of Polonius behind the curtain, the inspiration of the Old Testament inspiring the New in the Matthew image, we can again see that it's a similar profile but slightly twisted to show a more Mediterranean contrapposto. However, on this intriguing piece from the calf of Man on the Isle of Man, which is very much a sort of mid-Celtic Sea service station for the Pictish, the Dalriadan, the Irish, the Welsh, the Cornish, and for international traders who are continuing to ply their wares up that route, certainly well into the 9th century and the Viking Age. We can see, again, an aspect of this distinctive sidewards profile. And in the famous arrest miniature of Christ in the garden on the Mount of Olives, you can see very Eastern looking figures with their black beards for, are they the guards actually arresting Christ, or again with multivalence, are they the two attendants who hold up the hands of Joshua while he is in the process of vanquishing. So again, a symbolism of Christ vanquishing and overcoming death at the very point that he's seized by his enemies. And again, very similar to the Daniel profile and others on Pictish slabs. I think one of the most intriguing aspects of the shrine slabs at Rosemarkie is this tree of life, thought to date to around about 800. And it's almost a dead ringer for this symbol, which is on the tooled cover of the St. Cuthbert Gospel, Now, this is a little book containing the Gospel of John, which St. Cuthbert studied with his master Boisel at Melrose earlier in his career. And it's thought that it was probably made at Monk Wearmouth Jarrow and placed into the coffin of St. Cuthbert, perhaps when the relics were translated to the high altar at Lindisfarne in 698. And this is the, somebody's not muted, can they mute? And this is the earliest binding to have survived from Britain and Ireland, so dating to around about 700. And it's modelled both in the way in which it's put together, unsupported Coptic sewing, and the style of the decoration of the cover is modelled upon early Christian Coptic bindings from Egypt. And we can imagine the panel in Rosemarkie likewise making reference to the Tree of Life, and possibly even being inspired by just such a portable item as this little pocket gospel book, the sort of thing that you would take around in your ministrations to the sick and the dying, rather than the sort of book that would be used publicly in church liturgies. And one thing's for sure, wherever there are churches in this early period, they needed books. As we'll see, one of the problems that we labour with when talking about the influence of books in Pictland and in Alba generally is that very, very few of them have survived. But we know that there would have been many books present in order to have been able to support the liturgies and the studies of various centres, many of which are marked by the presence of surviving stones. This is Rosemarkie panel 3.1, and here it has one of the most beautifully executed examples of Greek key pattern, ultimately of Mediterranean inspiration, but one of the staple ingredients of fully fledged insular art. And this was one that, again, was a great inspiration to George Bain. Even this little panel at the centre of this deeply engraved niche on one of the stones can have different interpretations. You can see that there's a fourfold numerological division there, and that brings us immediately to when is a cross and when is it simply an ancient geometric symbol. But in the context of the other fragments, it would appear to be Christian, and you can see similar things in things like this central diamond boss. The diamond itself shape, the lozenge shape, has been shown by Jenny O'Reilly to be associated in the early Christian tradition with the mystical presence of the divine, if you like. And here we see George Bain looking at the principles of construction within the design of such symbols. My work on the Lindisfarne Gospels and the work of people like Robert Stevick earlier have shown that the complex designs of many of the deluxe gospel books, which are highly intellectualized, work on a numerological basis and use the golden section and Pythagorean and Euclidean geometry as the basis of their design, not only as an erudite thing and one designed to give a very good aesthetic experience, but also as part of a tribute to the principles of mathematics, etc., lying within the natural world, interpreted by Christians as the act of creation, emulated in the process of creating such artworks. Sorry, my throat's I've got a few throat problems at the moment, do forgive me. There can also be other interpretations. This is the opening of Matthew's Gospel from the Book of Kells. There's a great deal of debate about this particular manuscript, but it's thought, if there is any consensus, that it was begun on the island of Iona, off of Mull in the Hebrides, in the very end of the 8th, beginning of the 9th century, and that production was interrupted and then resumed when the monks were displaced by Viking activity at the beginning of the 9th century and set up another monastery at Kells in Ireland. As we know, this book is now one of the greatest symbols of Irish nationalism and national cultural identity, but it is is in effect a Scottish manuscript? Or is it, if it were made in Iona, which of course is the sacral heartland of the expat Irish kingdom of Dalriada? So you can see that already the complexities of geopolitical ethnicity begin to shape our appreciation and our understanding of the cultural significance of these works, not only in the period that they were made, but also in terms of how we discuss and appropriate them for contemporary discussions of such issues. Now, as early as the 1980s, Martin Werner suggested that some of the numerological designs in the carpet pages of the Book of Durrow were, if you like, stylized ground plans referencing the holy places. And there's a tradition of the hagiography of St. Columba, recorded by Adamnan, who was the abbot around about 700, that in the 680s, late 680s, a Frankish bishop called Arculf was coming back from pilgrimage to the Holy Land, that he comes through the Straits of Gibraltar, sails through the Bay of Biscay, comes to where I am at Land's End, hits bad weather, and instead of turning right and going up the English Channel, he goes left up the Celtic Sea and ends up spending Christmas on Iona, where he dictates his pilgrimage travel accounts to Adamnan, which are subsequently worked up by he and Bede as De Locis Sanctis, which remained the major pilgrim manual for travellers to the Middle East, the Baedeker Guide, right up to the 15th century, even though Bede only went 40 miles away from Monk Wearmouth Jarrow, an incredible journey of imagination and scholarship and the spirit. And that Arculf also drew for Adamnan ground plans of the holy sites on wax tablets. And there are a number of places in Kells, I'll show you one at the very end also, where the very unusual treatment of aspects of the iconography and design would appear to resemble ground plans. This looks rather like the entranceway into the Holy of Holies, if you like, the tabernacle, although it is in fact a decorative element containing the display script for the follow-on text from Liber, so Liber Generationis, the opening words of Matthew's Gospel. So when we see such things on the Pictish stones, although we're viewing them in a decorative context, we have to bear in mind that they can carry with them all sorts of deeper constructs and ring bells in the viewer's mind. Now, then as now, that depends how literate you are visually and what the shelves of your inner library of memory contain. And both Cassiodorus, the early 6th century monastic founder figure, and Cumian the Sage of Iona speak about when you study scripture, you fill the shelves of your inner library with things needful to know. And that would be like us sitting here tonight and watching a French film noir by Truffaut, if you like, where the boys' team might be saying, oh, there's not much narrative storyline here, where's the action? And girls' team might be saying, oh, but think how the protagonists resemble Abelard and Eloise. And the smart Alec in the back of the hall is saying, don't be ridiculous, it's all Jean-Paul Sartre's philosophical influence. Now, you can unpack the film you're watching at any or all of those levels of understanding simultaneously, either depending on your education background or on the intent of the maker, hoping to ring bells that will allow you to unpick it and explore it more deeply. Another thing to bear in mind when looking at the Pictish slabs, as this piece of artwork in Rosemarkie reminds us, is that some of the stones appear to have been painted. There are traces of pigment on early medieval sculptures from Britain at this time, which would of course have increased the stylistic impression of analogy with both manuscripts and with polychrome metalwork. This is a rather endearing, if chunky, little carved boulder of a ring-headed cross in Rosemarkie. It's not terribly skilled technically, but it does represent a new departure in depicting the cross in these islands, which is the idea of having the ring head. Now, this one is the St. John's cross on Iona, and it's, as you can see, it's pierced. It's quite difficult to achieve that, and it's been suggested that one of the reasons that the ring head is added is to give stability to the otherwise top-heavy structure of these deeply carved high crosses. You'll note also that there's an element here which may have received a boss. There's certainly a literary reference to robbers in the 9th century stealing a relic boss in metalwork from the centre of a similar carved cross in Lastingham in Yorkshire, which is a daughter house of Lindisfarne. And it's at Lindisfarne in the early 8th century that we have the first references to freestanding high crosses being used in the landscape for the Stations of the Cross, the Celtic turas. By 800 in Iona, they're certainly producing pierced ring heads. And here we have in Rosemarkie an attempt to emulate that without going down the complex line of how you actually achieve that technically. This one, an early 9th century recumbent cross marker from Rosemarkie, is very similar in its treatment of the carving and of the terminals of the cross to a whole series of recumbent cross slabs in Ireland, notably the group at Clonmacnoise on the Shannon estuary in the west. You can see here how similar that is. And all of these things speak of continuing cultural exchange and interaction in Scotland with Ireland, with Northumbria and other cultures, as we'll see. Now, moving on to George Bain for a moment. Let me just move this. Now, Bain, whose dates are 1881 to 1968, is considered to be an artist and educator whose instruction manuals on the methods of construction of Celtic art, and I use that in very large inverted commas for reasons that we'll see presently, were first began to be published in 1945, and Pictish stones were a very big influence in his artwork, along with illuminated manuscripts and metalwork from Britain and Ireland. And he not only did antiquarian style drawings of them, he also analysed them and devised systems of reproducing the designs systematically. His famous book, Celtic Art, The Methods of Construction, was published in 1951 and surprisingly had very little impact at the time. It wasn't until the 1970s when it began to be picked up on in a whole generation producing Celtic-inspired artwork. It depicted over 200 actual artifacts and gave detailed instructions on creating interlace, spiral work and trumpet designs. He's an interesting guy. He was born right up in the top of Scotland at Scrabster and subsequently served in Macedonia in the First World War, and then came back to be teacher of art at Kirkcaldy High School in Fife until he retired in '46, and then went on to really pursue his own artwork. And the Bain family were instrumental in donating a number of parts of the collection to Groam House in 1998, and the museum's done a wonderful job of expanding the collection ever since, to such an extent that in 2013 the Museum Galleries of Scotland formally recognised the collection as having national significance. And here we see some of the cover designs of the various editions, all based on his artwork, and you can see how the cover on the left is very much indebted to his studies of things like the Rosemarkie Greek keystone. Groam House is proud to point out that Bain's far-reaching influence even extended to the cover design of the King Crimson album Discipline, as you see here. And here's the man himself with some of his cartoon grids for transferring his designs onto walls and textiles. And you can see just how his grasp of it is informed by geometry, mathematics and the golden section, in just the way as we can demonstrate that of the original designers of these early medieval artworks was similarly inspired, and some of the manufacturing techniques that they used to establish their designs. There are a number of motif pieces on bones, slate and other materials, and wax tablets would also have been used as well, that survive. These ones are from Viking Dublin, but there are others from early Irish sites, and we will undoubtedly find more of them as time goes on from the mainland as well. And this is the back of the marked carpet page in the Lindisfarne Gospels, where you can see that compasses and dividers and rulers have been used to formulate the grid designs here and to lay out the cardinal points of the interlaced design. And then sections are worked up in detail as the actual motif pieces. Another thing that my research has shown that's interesting about the Lindisfarne Gospels from the 720s, 715 to 22, is that the maker seems to have developed the use of the lead pencil to give him the flexibility to produce such designs without having to score the design into the membrane and leave like plough lines, if you like, or to use ink. But also that he did the designs of everything, even one line initials on the back of each page, which indicates that he's developed the light box using transparent writing slopes of glass or horn, and then backlighting many candles in front of you, one candle behind you, or a big window in front of you and a small window behind you will give a light box. And that means that unlike stone and metalwork, in manuscripts using parchment or vellum for pared skin, you can actually backlight. So you can use the back of the membrane, which is expensive, as your own motif piece, and then backlight through so that the design shines through and isn't obliterated when you put on the first thick layers of pigment, and you can still turn it over and consult your own motif piece on the back if you need to. And much of the work, we think, done on the little island of Cuddy's Isle off of the main coast of Lindisfarne during the penitential retreats of Lent and Advent, when even the busy bishop, Eadfrith, who ran a diocese that's of Islandshire that stretched right up to the Firth of Forth and down into Yorkshire, was able to undertake his own spiritual work on the manuscript. And Bain going through very similar processes. So he's reconstructing not only designs, he's reconstructing process and mentality as well, although he doesn't ever go into some of the literary and theological sources for how these might have been viewed by their monastic makers. Again, we can't assume that the Pictish stones were made by a monastic craftsman, and the interface between secular and professional religious personnel is a very fluid and ambiguous one at this period. Bear in mind also that it's part of the Orthodox tradition, and that priests were allowed to marry, and that monasteries would not be secluded claustral places. Whole lay families would be attached to them. So they're quite vibrant places and often focuses of trade and communications. Again, we can show numerous instances where the design repertoire maps from one medium through to another, as in Rosemarkie and the Greek keys in Lindisfarne Gospels. And the beautiful chancel carpets that were made for the parish church on Holy Island at Lindisfarne by the women of the islands in the 60s were made using George Bain's designs drawn from the Lindisfarne Gospels to achieve these incredibly vibrant results. And my work has shown that, in actual fact, we were using prayer mats in Britain at this period as part of the legacy of the early churches of the East, that Islam subsequently also falls heir to that practice. So it is literally not just a carpet page because the carpet pages in manuscripts look like carpets, but because they're, if you like, skewer morphs in paint of the idea of the oratorio, the prayer mat that you on which you would venerate the cross. And here you can see Bain himself extrapolating some of the motifs, such as the trumpet spirals that we see in the Lindisfarne Gospels and on the carpet made from his drawings. And here he's placing motifs into more contemporary 20th century Celtic revival designs of his own, as in this greeting card that he sent to a friend. And here you can see the bronze memorial plaque that Bain designed to mark the cremation ashes resting place of he and his beloved wife, who died in 1957. And the central figure here is a modified and much adapted version of the head of I think it's Mark, but also of Christ enthroned in the Book of Kells, but adapted into a contemporary mid-20th century Celtic revival idiom. And as such, Bain forms part of a venerable tradition. This is the Chapel of Rest at Compton in Surrey, which was designed by Frederick Watson, his wife, and made with the help of the village blacksmith and other craftspeople as a great monument to the arts and crafts movement. And a number of the repertoire of insular Iron Age and Viking Age motifs incorporated into this neo-Romanesque Byzantine structure is quite remarkable. And Bain is very much picking up on this sort of tradition that the Wattses and William Morris and co. had promoted in the arts and crafts movement. Goes back even further though. This is a reissue in 2007 by of John Obadiah Westwood's Celtic and Anglo-Saxon art and ornament. And he again studied early works as an attempt to distill motifs that could inform the beginning of the arts and crafts movement. And this is one of his drawings in a manuscript, Egerton manuscript in the British Library. Going back even further, these facsimiles of an Insular Gospel book, Cotton Oath OC5 in the British Library, were made by Thomas Astle in 1730, in the 1750s, as part of an ongoing study for a manual of paleography that he published. And he actually illustrated his book by pieces that he cut out of early manuscripts. And these are his artworks based upon them. But even earlier than that, here's one for girls' team. This is a facsimile of the famous Textus Rofensis, the earliest Anglo-Saxon law code, that in a Romanesque manuscript that was made by Elizabeth Elstob, who died in 1756. And she was paid by the Duke of Oxford's librarian of the Harley collection 5 guineas in 1719 for producing a facsimile of this manuscript and one other. And here's the girl herself. She was renowned as what was known a blue stocking, and she was largely scorned by her contemporary male counterparts because she had the pretension of claiming to be an Old English scholar. And she was a very fine Old English scholar for her age, as well as a remarkable observer of paleography and codicology and artwork. And I like to think that one aspect of George Bain that still needs to really be looked at properly is that, as well as his design skills and techniques, he also had scholarly interests as well. This is an interesting drawing in the collection that he did of the lettering on the Newton stone. Now, this is a stone that has an inscription in Ogham, which is a proto-literate script developed in Ireland that is also found widely in expat Irish communities on the West British Atlantic coast. And it also had these enigmatic letter forms, which are so odd that it was thought they were perhaps added in the 20th century. But I think it needs to be studied more properly now, but I think that actually Bain has got it right when he juxtaposes the inscription with things like the Christ mosaic from Hinton St Mary in Dorset from the late Roman period, when he's focusing upon the Chi-Rho, the two first letters of the word Christ in Greek, and picking up on elements of the inscription, the first line here, seeing it as a Chi-Rho, and looking at frescoes from Coptic Egypt. And what we're probably looking at here is a semi-literate reworking or copying of an inscription in Greek, reading Christi Jesus Logos, Logos, and the sigma here is in the form of a tall S, which has been misinterpreted as this Y shape. Okay. So some of his work, I think, needs mining for things like this. He's also very avant-garde for his period in actually looking at cross-media studies and interdisciplinarity. Here you can see him comparing the eagle motif from a number of stones in the Rosemarkie area with things like the Lindisfarne Gospels in Lambeth Palace Library and a Psalter in St John's College, Cambridge, and also with details that he's drawn from the Tara brooch and the Ardagh chalice. So again, he's making in visual terms, rather than writing erudite articles, the connections across media studies, that the sort of thing that the rest of us have been writing very, very fully ever since. But he's definitely onto things. And he didn't just stop with things of local interest either. We're talking about a period when the great debates about whether these artifacts are English, whether they're Scottish, whether they're Irish, whether they're Welsh, is very, very, very heated. Okay, there had been a publication of a book by Massai called Le Miniature Dite Irlandaise. Now, before that, it was assumed that all of the great gospel books, Durrow, Kells, Lindisfarne, etc., were all Irish, and that style of Celtic art was Irish. But Massai challenged that. And then in the 1950s and 60s, the second set of excavations at Sutton Hoo and studies by Rupert Bruce Mitford and Julian Brown of the Lindisfarne Gospels in comparison with the Sutton Hoo material showed that a lot of it was actually Anglo-Saxon. That then promoted a whole debate and a pendulum swinging in which whole rafts of material were claimed by the Irish as theirs, by the English as theirs, and a lot of other of us have tried to get it to settle and actually say, well, this is why we actually coined the term insular of the islands of Britain and Ireland in the first place, because it can get you over some of those issues. Now, there are periods and certain contexts in which, as we know, our forebears and people now will die in those ditches of where things were actually made. There are other times in which they're perhaps working in a more ironic and collaborative environment, or making points about the universality of the traditions within which they sit. And some of the great artworks, rather like the Sutton Hoo burial mound and the Prittlewell burial, have artifacts and stylistic resonances that show the extent of the cultural contacts and trading contacts of the people buried there and their religious inclinations, and that these map into the encyclopedic assemblage of reference points in things like manuscripts and sculpture. And this is Bain's depiction of the great Sutton Hoo belt buckle. So he's looking at all of the different strands that he perceives in his first love of Scottish and Pictish art, but is actually faithfully tracing them back to source. This is a book that I published a couple of years ago as a sort of introduction to insular visual material culture, and the title is problematic. You'll find endless reviews that they don't get past the title, and that's because it's got the word Celtic, and of course the great archaeologist Barry Cunliffe is now saying there was no such thing as Celtic. Again, all hotly contested. Anglo-Saxon, the International Society of Anglo-Saxonists has just changed its name because the very term Anglo-Saxon is now thought to be racist in a post-colonial context. We're still allowed to say Viking at the moment, but probably not for much longer, given the attempts to rehabilitate them as something other than seagoing entrepreneurs. And Pictish at the moment is allowed to stand, you'll be pleased to know. And of course, the whole concept of Pictish is something that goes back ultimately to classical references, such as that in Caesar's De Bello Gallico in the 50s BC, and references to the Picts, the painted or possibly even tattooed ones. You can see this rather imaginative early 19th century antiquarian reconstruction of just how the Picts may have worn their symbols and artwork. And here you can see some artwork by one of the leading contemporary tattoo artists in Santa Barbara in California, who is still using George Bain's work among many other sources, including Gotland Pctish Stones and others as her source material. And it's interesting, she gave a paper recently about her perception of what the agendas of clients commissioning these designs actually says about now, and to what extent materials such as this is increasingly associated with white supremacist males. So there are all sorts of very weighty issues in terms of historic and contemporary culture that ride on some of the things that we're looking at today. Celtic Latin art, I am unashamedly going to retain the term. If nothing else, it refers to a genuine early linguistic grouping which sets these peoples slightly apart from other Germanic groupings, along with aspects of their artifactual profile. And the two key find sites of Hallstatt and Laten in Switzerland, a site on the banks of Lake Neuchâtel, where from around about 400 BC, a number of goods were thrown in, presumably as votive offerings to water deities, and from which Laten art takes its form, its name. Its use in the early medieval arts is known as Ultimate Latin because it goes back ultimately to the prehistoric Iron Age peoples, and it's still being used in Ultimate Latin context today. Here you can see some fine prehistoric examples from the 1st century BC to 4th century AD of Celtic style metalwork. And look at the ambiguity. Again, here is a hand pin from the late 5th century, early 6th. And at one level, it's Celtic spiral work and trumpet and pelter shield-shaped motifs. But we can see very clearly that it's also supposed to be a stylized cat mask. Okay, and so you can have different interpretations implicit within abstract or semi-abstract motifs. People like Archibald Knox appreciated this fully in the Arts and Crafts Revival. He was a Manx-based metal worker, and you can see the same processes of using foliate motifs as a springboard for the process of abstraction as that you find in Iron Age art and in some of the Pictish materials. And we're talking about a period when, if you were shipping in amphora and dinner services from the Mediterranean, and you got a free dinner service with your consignment of wine or olive oil, which we know is still coming up the Celtic Sea right up to the 8th and 9th centuries, you would then take some of those foliate motifs and use them as a springboard, weaving in also zoomorphic ambiguity and multivalence, and create these incredibly beautiful semi-abstract designs of the sort that Bain was so enamoured. When you see Celtic in past times catalogues, you're normally going to be confronted immediately with interlaced patterns, etc. And of course, that is taken to be an Anglo-Saxon feature primarily within insular art, although its origins go way back beyond the Anglo-Saxons into the Mediterranean world, and anybody undertaking pilgrimage to Rome through northern Italy, etc., as members of the Irish, Welsh, Cornish, Breton, Manx and Pictish early churches would have seen plenty of interlace, and the remains of the works of giants were available, showed that you would have such motifs on your mosaic dining room floors from Hadrian's Wall to Dura Europus. I'm going to speed up a moment. So some of the Sutton Hoo finds from very different contexts: Celtic manufactured hanging bowl, Roman style military parade armour, but interpreted in an early Anglo-Saxon style, things from the South Scandinavian and North German homelands, such as this helmet, and possible christening spoons in silver from Byzantium with Saulos and Paulos engraved on them, and the lyre from the great ship burial. Style to animal interlace par excellence on the Sutton Hoo ship buckle. And this is where I say you've got similar motifs coming into play in things like the Lindisfarne Gospels, and in a more distilled version on things like the stones. So imagine we were to go now into the latest restaurant on the streets of Rosemarkie, which happens to be a Chinese, Sicilian, Irish fusion restaurant. And when you read the menu, there would be things just in the very language that would summon up whole cultural Serengetis to you. Well, in the same way, the presence of these different strands of motifs, styles of lettering, use of references to different languages, Greek letters, stylized runes, Ogham style characters, Roman square capitals, would all summon up to the viewers the idea that these different ingredients are being assembled from the entirety of what was the then world view to create a statement about the whole of the flora and fauna of creation and logos being sustained, and all cultures coming together and meeting in logos, the idea of a supreme creative. Okay. And the designs and manuscripts, again, were very, very instrumental in formulating the repertoire of Latin art that Bain preserves and has transmitted to 20th century art. Here you can see a fine example though from Pitland. This is one of the stones excavated at Port Mahomac in Tarbert, up in the very northeast of Scotland, and you can see just how fine its appreciation in the 8th century of ultimate Latin, Iron Age trumpet spirals, etc., is, and how close it is to things like the manuscripts and the metalwork. And here the great Cairo in the Lindisfarne Gospels, where Germanic animal interlace and Celtic spiral work are sustained on a framework of Greek lettering. And these sort of ranges of initials from Lindisfarne, Kells and Durrow, again, very much a source of inspiration, as well as the text script in Bain's work, which again has gone on to inspire contemporary academic scholarship as well. The Book of Durrow is a very significant one that we think dates to the 3rd quarter of the 7th century, probably just after the Synod of Whitby in 664 in Northumbria, in which the churches of the insular world debated whether to follow older style traditions in the appearance of their personnel, with a different style of tonsure to the little crown of thorns that was favoured on the continent, and to the dating of Easter. A big controversy, and the Book of Durrow, I think, comes shortly on its tail. We can see from the recently discovered Staffordshire hoard how close the similarities of some contemporary Anglo-Saxon metalwork from Mercia are to the Book of Durrow, which is probably one of the earliest books made on Iona. And here, the evangelist symbols in the Book of Durrow, the man for Matthew, who looks like a little Sutton Hoo belt buckle on legs, enamel and cloisonné and gold one. This one, which looks like a Frankish eagle fibula. And these two, which look like Pictish symbol stones with the hip spirals on the lion and the calf. And so again, a complex encyclopedic view. And is this just an allusion to metalwork, or is it also meant to reference the vestments of the East? This is a contemporary Armenian gospel book where you can see the vestments are treated very similarly, and you'll find similar treatments on some of the Pictish stones. I know I'm now at my time. Would you mind if I prevailed on your good humour and just did another 5 to 10 minutes just to round up? You sure? Okay. Right, this is one of the earliest insular manuscripts to have survived, although we know that they were making them earlier. This one dates to around about 600. It's known as the Cachach or Battler of St. Columba. It's a Latin psalter, and we think that it is either the book or one that was made as a tribute to the copy of the Psalms that Columba is said to have written single-handedly in the 560s, but which he claimed as his own editorial work, which caused a big legal case in Ireland, in which he was accused of plagiarism, the first case of international copyright and IPR. And that is thought to have caused a major battle, which is one of the things that led him to set off on peregrinatio, voluntary exile of Christ, and to found Iona off of the island of Mull. So books very much instrumental, and Latin art forms being woven into the early designs of such books, which were subsequently often enshrined and kept at the shrines of key saints as contact relics for the swearing of oaths, freeing of slaves, and all sorts of transformative social practices. And we can imagine that this is likely to have happened also in Scotland. Certainly by the time of St. Margaret in the 11th century, there were references to books which seem to have been earlier enshrined insular manuscripts. And here you can see over here we've got Iona, and up here we're coming up to the area of Rosemarkie further north, and we can see that the riverine routes of the Tweed and the Clyde was one route across, and others going up the Firth of Forth, and the Lindisfarne diocese stretched right up to Aberlady and Abercorn, as well as its patronage extending out to Whithorn and Galloway. So we're talking about the lowland areas being very much tied in to the Northumbrian experience in some extent. And also to that, obviously, of Columba. And also here we've got the mainland western Argyll kingdom of the expat kingdom of Dalriada, an Irish settlement, which ultimately came to give the name Scotland, which means of the Scotti, which means of the Irish, when Kenneth MacAlpine finally united the Dalriadan and Pictish thrones in the 840s. Now, just a quick run through how the Rosemarkie stones fit into the Pictish experience. Class 1, Class 2, Class 3. Class 1 from the 6th to 8th century, possibly earlier, have just the symbols and no crosses. Class 2 often retain the symbols, but also have Christian motifs and iconographies and sometimes crosses. And that's thought to be the 8th into 9th century. And then Class 3 in the late 8th, well into the 9th century, which take on more Irish and influences from the Viking kingdom of Dublin and its hinterland as well, we think. So Class 1, a good example of that would be the Aberlemno roadside one with its serpent, redolent in antiquity of medicine. This that looks almost like a bridle bit, and a broken Z-rod and a mirror and comb. Again, is it denoting a territorial boundary, a dynastic marriage, a burial? A couple of them have been thought to be associated archaeologically with burials, but not many. and a whole range of these very distinctive symbols. The notched rectangle, one suggestion for that is it's a depiction of a broch, very distinctive Pictish style of monument. The triple disc and crossbar, possibly looking down into a ceremonial cauldron, feasting cauldron from above, those sort of things. There's a broch on Mount Mouser in Shetland, where Sir Gordon and I spent a lovely time with their family a while back. And this is the one side of the Aberlemno churchyard stone, and you can see the broch type notched rectangle, a Z-rod at cauldron, and this scene of an army. And here you can see some of them have distinctive helmets, and some of them are riding bareback, some of them have got stirrups, etc. And it's thought this might be a stylized depiction of the Battle of Nectansmere in 685, in which King Gwydir Mac Billy defeated and killed the Northumbrian king Edfrith, who'd made Cuthbert bishop. And so here we may see actually Edfrith being attacked by Carrion, having fallen on the field. And we can see again aspects of that scene relating to things like Hilton of Cadboll, and we can also see how things like the tabular ansata shape that occurs in one part of this monument relates to depictions of inscriptions in sculptures from around Hadrian's Wall. And there's a lot of influence, it seems, from Romano-British art retained in these more deeply Class 2 relief stones. The other side of the Aberlemno 2 stone is virtually a carpet page in stone, very similar to some of the manuscripts, although with a wonderful Pictish edition of things like these gorgeous seahorses, fronted seahorses. But imagine that painted, and you're very much in the realms of things like the cross carpet pages of the Lindisfarne Gospels. Now, one historical context for this that we should just mention is that in 710, King Nectan, who ruled from 706 until his death in 732, although he had 4 years in which he abdicated and became a monk, he gets a letter from the famous abbot of Monk Wearmouth Jarrow in Northumbria, Ceolfrith, encouraging him to listen to international arguments about the dating of Easter. Now, this had been simmering not only from the Synod of Whitby in 664, but from the 4th century. It's an ongoing one. Popes have been assassinated as a result of it. It was a big international diplomatic and political source of conflict. And it's normally presented as the debate at Whitby in 664 as Celtic versus Roman. Roman wins because Wilfrid is very eloquent, and the Celts, led by Colman, leave in a strop and go off to Ireland. It's interesting that the church at Port Mahomac, the famous Pictish Sutton Hoo, as Martin Carver has termed it, should be dedicated to Colman. And of course, another route round to Iona and to Ireland is to literally go up the top. And the name of Port Mahomac, the name of the area that Port Mahomac sits in is Tarbet, which of course means portage. It's where you carry your colours and your shipments, your consignments, and your personnel across, rather than having to sail around treacherous coast lines. In 664, the Anglo-Saxon Church opts in favour of international ecumenical practices. It's not a case of Rome versus Celtic. Many of the churches in Ireland had adopted Roman customs since 430s, when the Pope sent Palladius there to those who already believed in the southern parts of Ireland. It's international orthodoxy. The church in these islands at that time wasn't the Church of Rome or Celtic churches. It was an international Orthodox church. And the Columban tradition was taking a separatist, schismatic route, which international churchmen were afraid would lead to the same schisms and warfare that was tearing the Middle East apart at the time. That's why there's so much riding on it. And the rest of the islands gradually come round to the international Orthodox practices. Avivnon, Abbot of Iona, and St Cuthbert of Holy Island were amongst those who worked tirelessly to heal the rift. And in 715, Iona, the last bastion of Columban separatism, finally comes round to orthodoxy. That same year, Naples came round to orthodoxy, having been taken by the Arians and by Islam. Aquileia, at the head of the Adriatic between Italy and Croatia, comes round to orthodoxy, having been split in two for 300 years. And the Roman system of dating Easter is promoted in a liturgy, which finds its first appearance outside Rome in the Lindisfarne Gospels in around 715 and the following decade. So the Lindisfarne Gospels, I've argued at one level, is a statement of that international orthodoxy. And it's that Necton is buying into on behalf of the Pictish church and on behalf of the reformed Ionan community. And so it's quite natural that Pictish Class 2 art should reflect many of the same concerns in its designs and iconographies as that of Northumbria and of the Columban Perugia and the Book of Kells from that point onwards. So just a few other final analogies as we pass on. If we look at, again, this panel of the famous Rosemarkie stone that we started with, we can see again the idea of the carpet page and these stylized representations of different church traditions. An Armenian Kachkar, the sort of Armenian sculptures from the early Christian period that are thought to have been one of the sorts of inspiration behind these insular stones as well. The famous Nig stone, another prime example of Class 2 art, but again with these heavy snake bosses that Bain was obsessed with as well, which tie it increasingly into type 3 and the Irish experience picked up on there. And a very late Class 3 from Shandwick, which is still retaining the Pictish beast, although by this late 9th century period, the symbols have mostly disappeared, but the raised boss style and the deep relief carving of the Irish high crosses is very much in evidence. The Iona experience transports over to Ireland in the high crosses of Kells, for example. And we have on Lindisfarne some of the cross bases that may even relate to the early 8th century start of the tradition there. These are the two surviving Iona crosses. And the Book of Kells, taken to Kells and carried on there, and a whole series from around about 900 of deeply carved Irish high crosses, which are inspired by the Columban tradition and by the background of Pictish carving and insular manuscript art from Northumbria. The Book of Kells, incredible, complex in its Baroque depiction of iconography. Here we have two cats overcoming the faithful who are eating a little wafer of communion, but the cats in turn being overcome by two other mice who are on their back, and the salmon of wisdom being eaten by the otter. This is the genealogy of Christ, which includes things like a merman, similar to the depiction at Magel, seizing the name who gave birth to Jonah, Iona, and that for a long time was thought to be proof that the book was made on Iona, although at that period it's known as the island. It's not known as Iona until the 16th century. Nil desperandum, Iona is Hebrew for dove, which of course in Latin is columba. This is the only book that we can say for sure is from Scotland, early medieval Scotland. This is the Book of Deer, which dates to the 9th century. And we're a bit stymied because it's quite a provincial. This is probably not redolent of the highest grade of the sort of books that were produced in Scotland previously. It's part of a sort of almost a pocket gospel book tradition that is shared with Ireland at this period, where you get a sort of poor man's abbreviated linear stylized version of those much grander earlier depictions in things like the Book of Kells and Durrow. But it is a very, very, very significant Scottish manuscript. But we can't judge the presence of all earlier Scottish manuscripts by the style of this, no more than we could one of the 9th century Irish pocket gospel books reconstruct what the Book of Durrow or the Book of Kells would have looked like. Okay. However, if you look at this depiction of the cockerel in, or hen rather, in, it's cockerel, isn't it? Sorry, in the Book of Kells, you've got a dead ringer for it on one of the sculptures from Port Mahomack. Now, Port Mahomack is on this portage site on an isthmus in the north of Scotland, and it was excavated from 1994 to 2014 by an archaeological consortium based in York and directed by Martin Carver, who termed it the Pictish Sutton Hoo because of the wealth of material coming out of it. And the quality of the sculpture is incredibly high. It shows that there was a long-lived settlement there. In the 5th to 7th century, it was an elite centre with high-status tombs. In the 8th century, it was a Pictish monastery, yielding over 200 pieces of sculpture, and with workshops producing sacred vessels, metalwork, and probably making vellum for gospel books, the manuscripts. That was pillaged and burnt down by the Vikings. And in the 9th century, it became a trading centre and manufacturing centre, and then went on into the medieval period when it became a 13th century fishing village and a 15th century township of smiths and tinkers. Okay, there's the current church standing at the heart of the Pictish monastic site dedicated to St. Colman. Here you can see its position, Port Mahomack, there's Hilton of Cadboll, there's Shandwick and Nig, we've seen all of those monuments tonight, and there's Cromarty with Rosemarkie just off screen at the bottom. So you can imagine the seaborne communications along this route that would have meant that places like Port Mahomack would have had regular contact with places like Rosemarkie, and carrying on down the coast, ultimately even to Lindisfarne. This shows you the site of some of the Christian burials, some of the earlier ones with a different alignment to the later ones. Now, one of the Port Mahomack stones, like Hilton of Cadboll, has a Northumbrian inhabited vine scroll and a hunting scene of Pictish sort, and the inhabited vine scroll finds its closest parallels at things like this cross shaft in Yorkshire, in Northumbria at Croft. That's Hilton of Cadboll again. And even the famous St. Andrew's sarcophagus in St. Andrew's, dating to the 9th century, is now considered to have been the work of sculptors from Mercia in the Midlands of Anglo-Saxon England, with these David scenes. So again, it's a complex picture that is emerging. When we look at things like the friezes from Magel, we're thinking about things like the friezes at Breedon on the Hill in Mercia and the connections. This stone at Port Mahomack is very reminiscent in certain respects of the Daniel stone at Rosemarkie. This is the dragon stone with its ultimate Latin spiral work. And this scene of a family, a bovine family, is very much in the Pictish idiom. So the sculptures here, all very high quality, bringing together ultimate Latin, Northumbrian, Mercian, and very strong Pictish elements and Irish elements of a sort of centre that you can imagine continuing to have a nexus of cultural, ecclesiastical and trading contacts with all of those areas reflected in its archaeology. This piece of sculpture from Port Mahomack related to things like the central boss in the Lindisfarne mark page, which in turn is reflected in this glass mould, this glass stud from Dunad, the fort in Dalriada in Argyll. And finally, one area of the site yielded some very interesting layouts of stones and leather thongs, which is thought to relate to a sort of production technique for parchment and vellum. Parchment is sheep or goat skin, vellum is calf skin, of a sort still practiced in Ethiopia today, rather than the later medieval technique of having an upright frame that you stretch your skin on. In Ethiopia and the early Eastern tradition, they would do it flat on the deck. And that's what the layout of some of the finds at Port Mahomac is indicating that they were doing in the preparation of leather or possibly even vellum for making manuscripts. And these scrapers and awls, again, could have been used for manuscript-related bookmaking processes, but not necessarily. This stone, however, I think is a clincher. This is a dead ringer for the sort of display script that you get in Lindisfarne at the beginning of the 8th century. And this stone is thought to date to that period and shows very, very close links with manuscript culture at that period. That's Lindisfarne. So if we think about what might the books of Pictland have looked like, well, the Book of Kells, made probably on Iona around about 800 as the Baroque culmination before the tailing off, if you like, of the vernacular 9th century, is one example. This is another example, I think, of the place plans. This is a very odd shape for a Q. It's the beginning of the Gospel of Luke. This is actually a stylized ground plan of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, with the baptistry element here and the porticus chapels with the Alpha and Omega symbols, the beginning and the end at the centre. So this level of complexity and the Eastern Coptic allusions to a Coptic style Virgin and Child that we see here in Kells, with its Germanic Anglo-Saxon style borders and its ultimate Latin decoration and its Pictish beasts, is very much a sort of encyclopedic manuscript that we can imagine being the sort of thing that might have been produced at places like Port Mahomac and possibly even Rosemarkie. In the 1970s, when my mentor Julian Brown dared suggest that the Book of Kells could be a Pictish manuscript, he was laughed out of court. But modern archaeology and reassessment is beginning to show that we're not in little ghettos of purely local reference and association. It's a much, much bigger world picture that many of these centres were tied into. And so when in the Book of Kells, we see at the opening of Mark's Gospel, the lion attacking or devouring, the Lion of Judah devouring this figure, are we actually looking at one of the Pictish kings? Thank you.
Wow, thank you. That was an incredible, what a wide-ranging and stimulating view of everything. Incredible. We have no questions on chat at the moment. I think everybody's absolutely stunned into silence, really. I think you.
Oh, we've got one in the chat. Do any of the Groam House stones reflect influence from the Viking age?
All right. I'm sorry, I missed that. Oh,
well, you've got a couple of them are going into that sort of snake boss style, which, but I think the fact it's that the Viking stuff picks up on that in Ireland subsequently. So I think the Rosemarkie ones are probably standing like Nig, closer to the origin of that style. You do find that in Irish metalwork in the late 8th century, and it seems then to migrate into stones in Pictland and Iona, and then to give rise to this heavily deeply carved school of carving in the later 9th and 10th centuries in Ireland. So it's a bit of a chicken and egg scenario. When it comes into Viking art, it's coming through the Irish influences that in turn have been moulded by Pictland and Iona, I think.
I was going to say, you amply demonstrated why the Dark Ages are not dark at all. I mean, there's...
Brightly shining. So as we enter a new Dark Ages now, don't be too afraid. It will be different, but it won't necessarily be dark.
Oh dear. So certainly on behalf of everybody, I think we have a huge thank you for incredibly informative and entertaining evening. So much to pick up on and think about going forward. Thank you.
Oh, we got Victoria Whitworth out there, who's just published a fantastic new book on the Book of Kells. So watch out for that. She's given the link to it there. And we got somebody else who said, do the interactions of style between Pictish and Gaelic art reflect the spread of early Christianity through Scotland? Well, very, very much so. But bear in mind, when we're talking about this, we've also left something else out of the picture, which of course is that Ninian was at Whithorn in southern Scotland much, much earlier. So this is part of the story. There are still many other strands that we need to take into account. But yeah, I do think that the way in which we look at the artifacts can serve as markers for us to unpick things like conversion process and political interaction and annexation of territories. You've always got to be careful though of trying to pin too much on a specific event, but certainly the drifts and the impetuses are very much driven by historical context. How do I think the Eastern Mediterranean influence survived? Was it by movement of people or goods? Well, until I started my research project at Sinai, St. Catherine's Sinai 10 years ago, you couldn't say that there was direct contact between the Christian cultures of the Middle East and those of the insular environment without being laughed off the stage. Poor old Hilary Richardson did some wonderful work on early Armenian contexts, and none of it was ever really taken seriously. Increasingly now, it's flavour of the month as more and more people see that there's a lot of substance to it. Some of it is secondary and third-hand transmission of sources and influences through places like Gaul and Spain. But some of it is very definitely direct contact. We've got more and more archaeological evidence of that, and of the whole continuum of the late Roman trade nexus along the Atlantic seaboard in things like the recent excavations at Tintagel that I've been involved in, and inscriptions and things there. But my work in Sinai shows that certainly there were 2 Northumbrians from the 8th century present working as part of the scriptorium in St. Catherine's Sinai, at the foot of the mountain where Moses is said to have received the tablets of the law. And so that gives, if you like, a new credibility to things like the Adhavnan reference to Arkulf coming back from the Holy Land in Egypt and drawing and giving accounts of what he'd seen and bringing things with him, which has often been dismissed as a literary topos, in the same way as the tales of Prester John were considered to be a literary fiction for contact between Europe and the Orient in the later Middle Ages. But even if they are literary fictions, these fictions arise because they're responding to echoes of actual phenomena.
Fantastic.
When you see on the Aran Islands off the west coast of Ireland, though, the burial to the 7 Romani, does that mean that they were from Rome, or does it mean that they followed the Roman tradition? When you see in the southeast of Ireland a stone from the 7th century recording Olin the Egyptian, was Olin actually an Egyptian, or did he follow the Egyptian eremitic tradition of monasticism of the Eastern Fathers? I've done several articles bringing all of the evidence together and trying to bring a lot of it together and saying, what does that leave us with? And I'm firmly of the opinion that you've got all of those different levels of contact: primary, secondary, tertiary, literary, and de facto historical.
Wow. So we have another question here on chat. Following on from the discussion of the extra meanings unlocked by the naturalism of the Lindisfarne animals, could you talk about the extra meanings unlocked by the birds in the inhabited vine scroll on the Rosemarkie stone?
Well, there is a whole aviarum in the Middle Ages that develops out of the birds that are, again, related in the marvels of the East. A number of bird symbols do make it through. There's certainly in things like the Lindisfarne Gospels, there's a move away from the generic style 2 scissor beasties into distinctive canine and bird forms. I think it's more a question of the idea of the different elements and the different types of creatures being sustained by the word is, I think, why they're there. There have been attempts to actually define them as specific types of bird. Not all very successful. I think it's a stylized adaptation, but I think we're definitely supposed to be thinking about seabirds in that context. I'll just leave you with one last little tale, which was when I was loaned to the Lang Gallery in Newcastle for a month, along with the Lindisfarne Gospels in around about the year 2000, because I had to do all of the PR and the guided tours and what have you. It wasn't that I was sitting there with my shotgun. Prince Andrew made an unexpected, unscheduled visit to the museum, and I was called from coffee break to show him round, and he was being very naughty with the Lord Lieutenant and raising all of the questions about cultural restitution. You know, why can't the Lindisfarne Gospels go back to the post office on Lindisfarne, where Dick, my friend the postman, would be able to guard it for 2 hours on Wednesday morning, even though it was a high-level IRA terrorist target at the time. And he was breaking all the protocols, and we were going around with this and that, and I just had enough. And we came to a vitrine in the Lang of stuffed seabirds of the sort that Bishop Eadfrith may have seen from his cell window while he was designing the Lindisfarne Gospels, which was taking literalism just a wee bit too far. And I'm afraid I had my revenge. I paused for a moment, and he had his little flurry of ladies in waiting with him, and said, "And this, Your Royal Highness, I'm sure you're not familiar with, is a shag." At which point the ladies laughed and giggled, and he scowled at me and marched off. And I thought I'd really got in trouble that time. But 10 minutes later, I was dragged back from my second attempt at a coffee break and told that His Royal Highness would like to be taken round again, please. So, yeah, be very careful what you read into a shag, is all I can say in response to that.
Very good. A lovely story. So one more question here. What emphasis would you place on the Pictish contact with the stone carvings of the Romano-British tradition associated with Hadrian's and the Antonine Wall?
It's interesting, isn't it?
Well,
I guess in the same way as hack silver from the Roman Empire and things like the Traprain Law Hoard, etc. Is it payment? Is it tribute? Is it a desecration of a culture that you feel is an alien ideology? All of these questions are very difficult to address. But one way or another, and whatever the particular context, and with the Staffordshire Hoard, is it tribute? Is it the pickings over of a slain army? Is it a metal worker going to melt down the collective artifacts from the Mercian army to upgrade them all into contemporary style? We'll never know, perhaps, for sure. But one thing we do know is that cultural contact generates response. And it generates and can be tracked through artifactual response, almost archaeologically, almost better than in any other form of the evidence that we have. So I think it betokens the fact that there is contact, there is knowledge of that material. There is a wish, as in many what are called successor states in the early Middle Ages, to couch themselves as heirs of Rome, of successors of Rome, even if you hated their guts and wanted to overthrow them and put yourself in your place. You want to be what they were at one level. And so I think there's that perennial enduring thing of classicism and quotes of classicism that extends even to choices that are made stylistically and culturally to our day.
good. Well, the questions seem to have dried up. So yes, just thank you again so much. This has been amazing. It's a fantastic night for
I
us.
should just apologise for the shag references. I should not have said that, because there may be people whose sensibilities are offended. I do apologise. I'm from a different tradition of churchmanship. All I can say is I'm a lay canon of Durrow Cathedral, and I just put that out there in my defence.
Oh dear, very good. I don't think we've had a shag reference before during one of our academic lectures, so it is a bit of a first, but yeah.
I'll leave it out of the publication, don't worry.
I liked it. Brilliant.
Right,
Good.
my husband wants his dinner now.
Okay, well, that's very understandable. We should let you go.
Thank you for giving me so much of your time, everybody, and for allowing me to be just a little bit of your story tonight. It's a tremendous honour and a privilege, and I thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Excellent.
Yes, no, thank you very much.
Thank you, Doug. Thank you for having me.
Oh, I would have you again.
Be careful what you say in this context.
Absolutely, yes.
Right, can I close now? Are we okay?
We're okay. Thank you very much indeed.
Be well, stay safe, and can I come and say hello next time I'm up there?
Yes, please do.
Please do.
If any of you find yourself at Land's End, get my contact details from Alistair and come and see me.
Okay, we'll do that.
Bye now.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, Michelle.
Bye. Thank you.
Oh wow, what an evening.
That was excellent.
It was. For those of you that are left, I'm working